Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes people say history is boring, and I can understand why. It's often taught as dates, names, battles, kings, and assassinations without any blood, sweat, or stench of reality. But when you actually peel back the layers of history, when you stop treating it like a list and start treating it like a lived experience, you realize something rather unpleasant. Life in the past was often brutal, strange, and much harder than we imagine. And so tonight, let us step back into the Middle Ages, that dusty period we often think of as knights in shining armor, chivalry, castles, and romance. But instead of focusing on the ballads of gallant knights rescuing damsels, let's talk about what it really sucked to be a medieval assassin. Because, believe me, the movies and TV shows make them look sleek and mysterious. But the truth is far from glamorous. It's messy, uncomfortable, and far more tragic than thrilling. When you imagine a medieval assassin, perhaps the first picture that comes to mind is someone cloaked in shadows, moving across rooftops, blades hidden under tunics, whispering oaths of secrecy. That image is shaped by modern pop culture. But the reality? No clean uniforms, no advanced weapons, no parkour. Just grit, danger, and a life expectancy that would make you think twice before signing up for the job. You were not a shadowy mastermind. You were often a disposable tool in a time when life was cheap and brutal. First, consider the simple fact of hygiene. We live in a world where you can bathe daily, brush your teeth, spray deodorant, and wash clothes. In the medieval world, especially in Europe, that luxury did not exist for the majority. If you were an assassin, you had to live among filth, disguised as one of the common people. That meant you stank like everyone else. Your breath was foul, and your body carried lice and fleas. Imagine having to hide in close quarters, waiting for your target while you're scratching your skin raw because of infestations. No sleek leather uniform, no clean, silent boots. Just the constant irritation of living in grime. Weapons were not glamorous either. You didn't have lightweight, perfectly balanced daggers forged by secret masters in hidden caves. You had crude steel, often heavy, dull, and unreliable. The maintenance of a weapon was a burden in itself, and you had to make sure no one discovered you carrying it. If you needed poison, good luck. The knowledge of poisons existed, but it was crude, unreliable, and often dangerous to the assassin himself. Many historical records show people dying from their own poisons more often than successfully deploying them. The act of preparing such tools was risky, and if caught, you'd face a death sentence, often by torture. There was no romanticized brotherhood guiding your every step, no powerful network. You were a pawn. Now let us talk about mobility. Pop culture would have you believe assassins ran across rooftops like agile cats, leaping from tower to tower. But medieval towns weren't built like modern urban playgrounds. Roofs were steep, made of clay tiles or thatch, often unstable and incredibly dangerous to climb. A single slip could send you falling into muck-filled streets below. And remember, these streets weren't paved boulevards. They were cesspits. Literally. People threw chamber pots out their windows, and you could be wading through human waste, rotting food and dead animals. Sneaking around at night wasn't cinematic, it was suffocating. Disgusting, and often deadly. The risk of being caught was another nightmare. Unlike modern times, where law enforcement has rules, medieval justice was swift, brutal, and public. If suspected of murder, you weren't guaranteed a fair trial. You could be tortured until you confessed, guilty or not. Execution wasn't a clean bullet to the head, it was hanging, burning, quartering, or worse. Sometimes your head would be placed on a pike as a warning. Imagine living every day knowing that if anyone suspected your true purpose, your death would be slow, painful, and humiliating. Assassins were not seen as noble warriors or rebels for justice. They were reviled, despised, and hunted. While kings might employ them from time to time, once the job was done, loyalty didn't matter. You could be killed simply to keep you silent. If you weren't killed, you might be imprisoned, your family left to starve, your name erased. There was no pension, no honor, no ballad sung about you. You were a disposable knife. That was the reality. And think of the psychological toll. Killing in cold blood was not an easy task, even in a violent age. Warfare was common, yes, but stabbing someone in the shadows, perhaps while they slept, was viewed differently than fighting in open battle. It left stains not only on your hands but on your soul. If you were caught in religious Europe, you could be branded a sinner, cursed as damned, denied burial in sacred ground. In Islamic regions, in Christian regions, in Jewish regions, all faiths agreed assassins lived outside divine law. You were playing with your eternal soul every time you lifted a blade. Imagine living with that fear, not just of death, but of eternal punishment. Now let's also consider survival. Unlike soldiers or mercenaries, assassins could not openly ply their trade. You had to blend in as a farmer, a beggar, a merchant, sometimes even a monk. That meant living double lives, never fully belonging anywhere. You had no stable community, no roots, no one to turn to. The paranoia ate at you. Who could you trust? Who would betray you for a handful of coins? Living in a world without surveillance cameras may sound like an advantage, but it also meant rumors and suspicions spread fast, and mobs could be stirred up with little evidence. And here's the cruel irony: most assassins in history were not even given the dignity of independence. They were tools of politics. Kings and queens, nobles and bishops. These powerful figures used assassins the way you'd use a hired hand. You weren't fighting for freedom or justice, you were silencing rivals, eliminating threats, enforcing grudges. You were expendable, and even if you succeeded, the story would never celebrate you. Your name would be erased, your deeds swallowed by the very people who ordered them. It sucked not only because it was dangerous, but because it was thankless. Life expectancy was short, even without the assassin trade. Plague, famine, war, poor medicine, death lurked everywhere. Becoming an assassin simply hastened your fate. Few lived long enough to retire. And what did retirement even look like? A scarred, haunted man with blood on his hands, trying to pretend to be a farmer after years of shadow work. It rarely ended well. We romanticize the medieval period because we see castles lit by torches, swords clashing, knights jousting. But if you peel back the curtain, you find lice in the beds, dung in the streets, blood in the mud, and fear in the hearts of those who lived in constant survival mode. And among the lowest rungs of this brutal ladder was the assassin, living in shadows, hated by all, hunted by many, feared by few, and often forgotten. Now, when I call this boring history for sleep, it's a kind of ironic title, because the truth is not boring at all. But it is grim, unpleasant, and ugly, the kind of history that reminds you how good you have it now. Because we have deodorant, we have medicine, we have law courts, we have cities where the streets aren't rivers of sewage, we have jobs that don't require us to slit throats in the night just to survive. And when you realize that, you stop seeing history as dusty facts and start seeing it as awake, up call, not boring, sobering. So the next time someone says they want to go back to the Middle Ages, remind them what it really meant. No Wi-Fi, no hot showers, no rights if you were poor, and if you happened to be one of those unlucky souls hired to do the dirty work of assassination, your life was short, miserable, and destined for obscurity. It may sound thrilling in novels, but in reality, it sucked to be a medieval assassin. And perhaps that's the best bedtime story. Because once you know how harsh the past really was, the comfort of your bed, your safety, and your peace will lull you into a deeper appreciation of the life you have now. If you really want to know why it sucked to be a medieval assassin, let's step into their shoes for a moment. Picture yourself in the 12th century, somewhere in the mountains of Persia, in the service of the infamous sect that gave birth to the word we still use today, the Hashashin. They were a group feared throughout the Middle East and even whispered about in Europe. To outsiders, they were shadowy killers who appeared out of nowhere, struck swiftly, and vanished into the crowd. But for the young recruit who joined their ranks, life was far from the grand mystique painted by enemies and legends. You would be sworn into secrecy, indoctrinated, and told that obedience to your master was more important than your own life. You were not just an assassin, you were a tool of psychological warfare. Their goal was not only to kill targets, but to terrify powerful rulers into submission. You could be ordered to stab a vizier in the middle of a mosque or eliminate a crusader leader in front of his army. Your life expectancy, once given such a mission, was almost zero. You were expected to die in the act or shortly after. Imagine the pressure of living with that knowledge, knowing that every day was a countdown to your own death. And think of the conditions you had to endure, traveling long distances on foot, often through deserts, forests, or mountains, all while disguising yourself as a pilgrim or merchant, carrying nothing more than a concealed dagger. There were no safe houses, no organized networks like modern espionage agencies. If you were caught, you were not seen as a soldier, but as a dishonorable murderer. The torture inflicted on captured assassins was legendary. Fingers crushed, bones broken, skin flayed, all done publicly to send a message that such treachery would not be tolerated. And still young men continued to be recruited, often from poor families, promised spiritual rewards or a place in paradise. The irony is heartbreaking. You gave your life for a cause that you never truly benefited from. The psychological manipulation was intense. Leaders of such groups promised you eternal salvation for your deeds, using religion as a tool to control. If you hesitated, you were threatened. If you questioned, you were silenced. And once you carried out your act, there was no escape. You didn't run to a safe land. You either died on the spot, killed by guards or an angry mob, or you lived long enough to be dragged into dungeons. The few who survived were broken men, living in constant paranoia. What kind of existence is that? The history books may mention the Hashashin with awe, but the individuals themselves were trapped in a cycle of manipulation, danger, and despair. Now, let's cross over to medieval Europe. Assassination was common here as well, though not as organized. Kings, queens, and nobles often resorted to hiring cutthroats to eliminate rivals. Imagine being one of those hired blades. You weren't a knight with armor and honor. You were usually a desperate man, a criminal, someone with nothing to lose. Your payment might have been a handful of coins, barely enough to feed yourself. And for that, you risked everything. If you were caught trying to poison a goblet of wine or stab a rival noble, your punishment would be horrific. Executioners in medieval Europe were creative. They could boil you alive, draw and quarter you, or flay your skin as a spectacle for the crowd. And yet people agreed to do it because poverty was so crushing that even a handful of silver seemed worth gambling your life for. That shows how brutal life was in general. Starvation was often worse than death. Think about the logistics of assassination in those times. No silencers, no sniper rifles, no escape cars waiting outside. You had to get close, dangerously close, with nothing but a knife, sword, or poison. You had to rely on human error, on the guard looking the other way, on the chaos of a crowded feast. If you missed your chance, there was no second try. If your dagger slipped, if your poison was detected, you were finished. Many assassins failed and were executed immediately. History doesn't even remember their names. Only the rare successes are written down, and even those are usually credited to the kings or nobles who ordered them, not the assassin who carried it out. And what about the environment you lived in? The medieval world was already hard for ordinary people. Food was scarce, winters were bitter, disease was rampant. As an assassin, you had it worse. You were constantly on the move, never settling, always looking over your shoulder. Sleep was never peaceful because you lived in constant fear of betrayal. Trust was impossible. One wrong word spoken to the wrong person could expose you. One innkeeper, suspicious of your behavior, could alert the authorities. Every bite of food could be your last meal. And if you were traveling disguised, you had to blend in convincingly. That meant working as a servant, a stable boy, a peddler, just to get close to your target. The life of luxury shown in films simply did not exist. You were more beggar than noble, more fugitive than warrior. Consider also the lack of medical care. If you were wounded in the act or during your escape, there were no hospitals to treat you, no antibiotics to prevent infection. A single cut could fester and kill you. A broken bone could cripple you forever. Pain was constant. Even pulling off a successful kill left you battered, bloodied, and often unable to hide the evidence. And remember, there were no disguises that could mask blood stains in a time when laundry was a rare chore. Every detail worked against you. Now let's examine the mental strain. Today, we have the term post-traumatic stress. Soldiers and veterans often speak of it. Imagine living with that in an age without understanding, without therapy, without compassion. The assassin lived with nightmares, with guilt, with fear, but could never speak about it. To confess was to die, so you kept it locked inside until it ate you alive. Alcohol became a numbing agent, but even that couldn't erase the weight of lives taken. Some assassins turned to religious rituals, hoping for forgiveness, while others hardened into shells of men, detached from humanity. The legends of cold, ruthless killers may be partly true, but not because they were born that way, because the job forced them to bury their humanity just to survive another day. Even the weapons they carried were primitive. A dagger might slip, a sword might shatter, a poison might lose its potency. Compare that to today's precision. Back then, everything was uncertain. Even the environment betrayed you. Imagine creeping through a castle corridor by torchlight, every shadow hiding a guard, every creak of the floor threatening exposure. Or imagine standing at a crowded feast, trying to slip poison into a goblet while the room swirls with laughter and eyes. One false move and you're dead. The sheer anxiety of it is enough to drive a man insane. And yet, despite the terror, despite the filth, despite the lack of glory, assassins were necessary in that brutal age. Power was fragile, rivalries fierce, and bloodshed constant. Wars could be prevented or ignited by the death of a single person. Assassins were pawns in this larger game, always expendable, never remembered. They lived in shadows, died in silence, and were air-raced by the very people who used them. Their stories rarely survive because history is written by kings, not by killers. If you step back and look at it, what strikes you most is the lack of choice. Many assassins weren't villains who chose a life of bloodshed. They were forced into it by poverty, coercion, manipulation, or desperation. A poor man with starving children might agree to take on a job just to feed them for a few weeks, even if it cost him his life. A young boy manipulated by a cult might believe he was serving God. A servant ordered by his master to carry out a killing had no option to refuse. And so, the assassin was often a victim as much as a villain. The romantic image of free will and agency collapses when you realize how little power they truly had. That's why when we look at history honestly, it becomes both terrifying and sobering. The past is not a fairy tale. It is a graveyard of suffering, of ordinary people crushed by extraordinary forces, of individuals caught in webs they could never escape. The medieval assassin was not a hero, not a noble warrior, not a character out of legend. He was a man trapped between the filth of his age and the cruelty of his masters, burdened with deeds that destroyed his soul, living in a world that offered him nothing but fear and death. When we peel away the layers of myth and try to see through the eyes of the medieval assassin, we are confronted with a world more brutal than fiction ever dares to show. Imagine the moment you were first recruited, not with ceremony or grandeur, but often with intimidation. You might be a boy from a poor village with no inheritance, no land, and little hope. A stranger approaches you, whispering promises of purpose, of importance, of a chance to rise above the mud and hunger that define your life. He tells you that you can be part of something greater, a blade of destiny, a servant of God's justice or your Lord's ambition. In your youthful desperation, you believe him. But once you are inside, you discover quickly that you are not a chosen one. You are merely expendable. The training was nothing like the polished schools of martial arts we see today. There were no safe mats, no structured lessons. You were taught in secret, in barns or caves, using dull blades until your hands bled. You learned how to slip a knife between ribs, how to move quietly in heavy boots, how to strike a man when he least expected it. Mistakes were not tolerated, for mistakes meant exposure, and exposure meant death, not only for you but for those who trained you. The lessons were harsh and relentless, and fear was the whip that kept you moving forward. Many recruits never made it to their first mission. They were broken by the training, discarded without a second thought. If you survived the training, you entered a world of shadows. There was no uniform, no symbol of pride. Your disguise was your life. One week you might pose as a wandering peddler, carrying trinkets and cheap wares to markets. Another week you might pose as a servant, bowing low, carrying trays of food, all the while waiting for your chance to slip a powder into a cup. Every role you played chipped away at your identity until you no longer knew who you really were. You lived so many lives that your own face felt like a mask. That constant disguise was exhausting. There was no off-duty when you were an assassin. Every gesture, every glance, every word had to be calculated. To be careless was to die. Think of the environment in which you had to operate. Castles and palaces were not easy targets. They were fortresses with thick walls, iron gates, armed guards, and suspicious servants. Getting close to a noble required bribery, luck, or months of careful infiltration. Even then, you might find yourself waiting in silence for hours, your heart pounding, your dagger hidden in your sleeve, until the right moment appeared. And when that moment came, you had only seconds to act. Strike too soon, and the room would erupt into chaos. Strike too late, and your chance was lost forever. The weight of that decision sat on your chest like an anvil. You were expected to kill without hesitation, but hesitation was human. That conflict between duty and humanity never left you. History is filled with examples of such moments. Consider the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. 4 knights, loyal to King Henry VI, stormed into the cathedral and struck him down at the altar. While not stealthy assassins in the modern sense, they acted with the same cold purpose. Imagine being one of them, swinging your sword inside a holy place, blood spraying across sacred stones, hearing the gasps of priests around you. You might have told yourself it was loyalty to your king, but deep down you knew you had desecrated a sanctuary. Such acts haunted men for the rest of their lives, even if they outwardly justified them. That is the shadow an assassin carried. Not just the danger of death, but the burden of damnation. Or consider the political killings in the Byzantine Empire, where emperors were overthrown and blinded, where poison found its way into chalices and daggers into sleeping rulers. To be an assassin in Constantinople was to live in a nest of serpents. One day you were paid to eliminate a rival general. The next day you were marked for death yourself by the very man who had hired you. There was no loyalty, no lasting alliance, only shifting sands of intrigue. You could never rest, never breathe freely, because the wheel of power turned endlessly, crushing those who stood upon it. In such an environment, an assassin was both a weapon and a victim, used and discarded in the endless hunger for control. Let us not forget the terror of the common people. For ordinary villagers or townsfolk, assassins were not heroes. They were nightmares, proof that no one was safe. If a lord could be struck down at his feast, if a priest could be poisoned in his monastery, what safety was left for the common man? The very whisper of assassination spread fear like wildfire. Assassins were not celebrated, they were cursed. Mothers would pull their children inside when strangers passed. Markets would fall silent when rumors spread that a killing had occurred nearby. You, as the assassin, walked through these streets carrying the knowledge that everyone who glanced at you might see a monster, even if they didn't know your true identity. The isolation was suffocating. You could never confess, never share your burden. Your existence was a lie told to everyone you met. And if you believed for a moment that your masters cared about you, you were sorely mistaken. Kings, lords, and religious leaders used assassins the way a man uses a dagger, gripping it tightly when needed, then tossing it aside when dull or dangerous. If you succeeded, They might reward you with a handful of coins or perhaps a promise of protection. But promises in the Middle Ages were fragile things, broken as easily as clay pots. If you failed, or if you knew too much, you were erased. Some assassins were killed by the very people who hired them, silenced to ensure secrecy. You could never trust that your employer wanted you alive once the task was done. Every handshake was a possible betrayal, every reward a possible trap. Consider also the religious fear that clung to every act. In a deeply pious world, killing outside of battle was seen as a mortal sin. Priests warned of eternal damnation, of hellfire awaiting murderers. Even if you told yourself you were serving a higher cause, doubts gnawed at you in the silence of the night. When you closed your eyes, did you hear the cries of those you killed? Did you imagine their souls accusing you before God? You had no confessor, no forgiveness, because to confess your crime was to expose your secret. And so, the assassin lived with a unique curse, guilty enough to fear hell, but too trapped to ever seek redemption. It was a spiritual prison as much as a physical one. Travel itself was another burden. The world of the Middle Ages was not connected by highways or airplanes. To reach your target, you trudged through endless mud, across freezing mountains, through forests teeming with wolves and bandits. Each journey was perilous. You slept under the stars or in foul, smelling inns, ate stale bread and thin broth, and carried little more than what you could hide beneath your cloak. Every step forward was heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, all of it weakened your body before you even reached your task. By the time you stood before your target, you were often sick, worn, and trembling. Yet you had to perform with precision, as if you were at the height of your strength. Failure was not an option, but success felt hollow, for it only meant you had survived to face another mission. The stories that filter down to us today are romanticized, but if you dig beneath the myths, you find more failures than successes. For every ruler struck down by an assassin's blade, dozens of others survived attempts, and dozens more assassins died nameless deaths in dungeons, their bodies left to rot, their names erased. Think of William the Silent, leader of the Dutch revolt against Spain. He was assassinated in 1584 by a man named Balthasar Gerard. Gerard succeeded, yes, but he was captured and tortured with unspeakable cruelty before being executed. His family, far from being honored, was ruined. His reward was nothing but pain. Yet history remembers William the Silent. Gerard is little more than a footnote, a cautionary tale of a man who gambled his life for a cause and lost everything. That was the reality. Even success led to destruction. And then there was the problem of memory. The assassin's name rarely survived, except as a curse. You did not become a hero sung in ballads, not even a villain in famous stories. More often, you became nothing. Your body was buried in an unmarked grave, your deeds forgotten, your life erased. The lords who ordered the killing claimed the glory or spun the narrative to their benefit, while you were cast into oblivion. What greater tragedy is there than to risk everything, endure everything, sacrifice everything, only to be erased from history itself? If we truly imagine what it was like, it becomes clear why it sucked to be a medieval assassin. You were poor, you were expendable, you were hated, you were hunted, you were tortured, and you were forgotten. The legends may make it sound exciting, but legends lie. The truth is raw and ugly. The assassin was not a free spirit gliding over rooftops. He was a desperate soul trudging through filth, haunted by death, shackled by fear, and consumed by shadows. That is the history few want to hear, because it robs us of the fantasy. But it is the truth.